Tour. Today's webinar is entitled When Webinars Attack, Getting from Tedious to Terrific. The presenter is Laura Solomon. Laura is the Library Services Manager for the Ohio Public Library Information Network and the former Web Applications Manager for the Cleveland Public Library. She's been doing web development and design for over 12 years in public libraries and as an independent consultant. I'm now happy to introduce Laura Solomon.
Hi, thanks, Eileen. Can everybody hear me okay? You can use your little check mark or, oh, hands are good. Just want to make sure, good. Okay, lots of hands. This is a good thing because the very first thing you need to know in a webinar is if nobody can hear you, the whole thing is absolutely pointless. So let's assume that everybody can hear me. Thank you so much for answering that. And let's get started with when webinars attack. How many of you have sat through absolutely horrendous, boring webinars? Go ahead and use that little hand again. I'm watching the responses come in, and it's like a 100% response rate. Absolutely everyone. We have all sat through these things, and there's all kinds of reasons, and we're going to talk about reasons about why these things can go so badly. But I want to talk a little bit first. Oh, by the way, in case you want to use this hashtag, you can use the one that InfoPeople described earlier, or I've got one that I also use for this presentation. So if you want to talk about how boring I am, you can do that on Twitter using this particular tag, and I'll be sure to see it. Or use the other hashtag and maybe I won't see it. But I want to talk a little bit first about how I came to do so many webinars and really how I got to be comfortable with it. I actually had someone ask me several years ago, they were just starting out with public speaking. They were starting to give presentations out in library land, and they were pretty nervous. And they wanted to know, should I join Toastmasters? Should I practice in front of a mirror? I'm still not sure what the best advice would have been for this person. But I explained how I got to be comfortable with presenting. And I have to tell you, this is not a route that I would recommend for everyone because this was pretty much trial by fire. In my first career, I was an environmental education teacher. And my job was to keep inner city kids who had barely ever seen a tree interested in things like life cycles of frogs and the dietary habits of things like turkey vultures, which are actually pretty fascinating. You throw up on their enemies, which is kind of disgusting, but kids love that. But possibly I was teaching this stuff while it was cold and pouring or even hailing. And those kids from the inner city especially, most kids just don't own things like Gore-Tex raincoats, heavy-duty outdoor gear. And so you learned pretty quickly that you had to make these topics interesting, or two things were going to happen. The first one is that the final evaluations from the visiting parents and teachers would pretty much rip you to shreds. And the second thing is that the kids honestly would probably beat them to it just because they were bored to death. However, interesting, if you want to put that word in quotes, is really a very tricky word. And it often means something different from one person to the next. You might be interested in model planes, the next person might not be. So the hook that you get to people to get to listen to you is going to be different too. And I quickly discovered that I needed to replace the word interesting with the word relevant. And because it was my job to make those classes relevant to those kids. Like I said, many had never seen more than an occasional tree in the park, to the point where they not only weren't bored, but they could make some kind of personal connection to that information that I was giving them. And without that personal connection, that information would go in one ear and out the other, and like I said, two things would happen. I'd get ripped to shreds one way or the other. So in other words, it was my professional responsibility to give them a reason to care. And I've since translated that experience to presenting. And I want to help you perhaps translate some of that experience as well without having to go through what I did. Although I have to tell you that was one of the best jobs I ever had. Now, this is not actually a picture of me because this is not what I look like, but it might as well be during most webinars. And I suspect most of you probably look the same since I took a little poll of you just a little bit ago, and just about everybody, if not everyone, put their hand up. So we're all pretty used to being bored. We've all been there. We've all been stuck in a webinar for continuing education or something, and we're bored to tears. And we're doing all sorts of things that were not related to the webinar. In fact, Nancy Duarte wrote a great book. She's author of Slideology, which is actually the word slide, and then there's a colon in the middle, ology. And she did some polling, and she found that barely 15% of the respondents in her poll, just barely 15%, actually just sat and watched a webinar. The rest were checking their email, texting, doing other work, even going to the bathroom, surfing, any number of things. And I guarantee, I bet you anything, I'm not going to ask because I don't want you to have to confess up here, but if I were you, I'd be doing something else while you were listening to me, because that's just the way I am. I multitask, and quite honestly, I don't think I'm going to engage your attention for the full 4 hours. My gosh, we'd all be gone by then. The full hour. So, you know, that's a pretty depressing number. If you're a presenter, you're thinking, oh my gosh, you know, 15% best case scenario are actually just going to sit there and listen to me? Oh, but it gets worse, right? Because leaving a webinar is really, really easy. It's easy to leave a webinar. And, you know, you can always check the X in the top right-hand corner. You say, I'm out of here. I've had enough. And, of course, you can always mentally check out. This sort of underscores the futility of trying to control what your audience does. Heck, people mentally check out when they're physically present. How many of you have sat through an in-person or a live, you know, you're in the room with somebody kind of presentation, and you've mentally done something else? Or, heck, you know, you're on, nowadays we've got phones, right, or tablets. We can be doing, you know, pretend to take notes, and we can be doing all sorts of things like checking Facebook and Twittering and everything else. Right, well, we've all done it, right? We have limited amounts of attention. I always joke that I have the attention span of a gnat. So if you can entertain me, you're doing a great job. But it's really, really easy to leave a webinar. So if you're a presenter of a webinar, or you're going to be a presenter of a webinar, you might be feeling like this about now, thinking, oh, forget it. Nobody's going to listen to me. It doesn't matter what I do. And that there is a reality there that you have to understand, that nobody is going to probably give them your undivided attention. And maybe also you've given a webinar before and you found the experience to be a bad one. You know, there's always that deadly silence while people don't talk to each other, right, or to you, or even in the chat, because I keep one eye on the chat just to see what's going on there. You know, sometimes nothing's happening. You're wondering, is anybody paying attention? Is anybody getting any of this? Nobody's responding to questions you ask, and when they ask questions, maybe they ask those dreaded questions you hope nobody's going to ask or you weren't expecting. Maybe your evaluations have come back with poor comments. Maybe you haven't given a webinar, but you're going to in the near future, and now you're nervous because of everything I just told you. Whatever your situation is, you can do this, take a deep breath, and you can do it well. But it's going to take some work and possibly some changes on your part. So here's what we're going to look at today. Here's what you're going to learn about today. How webinars go bad. I bet, honestly, if we did a poll, you could give me tons of reasons about why they go bad. So we'll see how my list compares to probably the mental list you're already compiling. Common problems and effective strategies. So what tends to go wrong and how to fix it. What does this mean to me, Laura, which I'll talk about when we get to it. Some tech tips, some obvious, perhaps some not, and lastly, some questions. But having said that questions is there at the end, I actually prefer to take questions in context. I think it makes more sense, it's more engaging, and I think it's kind of rude to say, don't talk to me until the end. So if you have questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A box. If you put them into the chat box, I may also see them, but I'll have to tell you honestly that on my screen, the Q&A box is much more visually appealing. So and has more space. So if you can put it in there as we're going, I will do my best to answer them as I can in context rather than shoving them all to the end. So why do webinars go bad? Let's take a look at some of the most common reasons that they go bad. Now this is pretty obvious, right? People can't see you. But I think many people actually underestimate how much of a role this really plays. Because in real life isn't the right word. In live, we're live now. In person maybe is better. In person presentations, there's nonverbal cues and body language. And those play heavily into human interaction. When you and the learners can't see each other, like you can't see me and I can't see you, that's a huge obstacle to overcome. How many of you have ever had an email misinterpreted? You can use those hands, you can use the checkbox. Yeah, pretty much everyone. I can't imagine that anyone who's been using email for any length of time has never had an email misinterpreted. And that's because there is often no nonverbal cues. That's why people started throwing emoticons in, right? That's why we've got smiley faces now, so that to kind of give some kind of nonverbal cue that I didn't mean this in a bad way, so here's a smiley face to make it all better. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But all of that is missing in a webinar. There's no, I mean, I suppose I could throw smiley faces up there, but really you're not seeing me. For example, right now I'm a very hand-wavy kind of speaker. I don't know what the term is for that is. Physically, I don't know. My hands are waving around. So you're not seeing that, but I'm feeling very passionate about what I'm talking about. You can't see that. The only way you could potentially get that is through my voice. And so in some ways, it's literally the blind leading the blind, because people can misinterpret what you say, just like they can in an email. Voice does have more inflection, of course, hopefully, than an email, but misinterpretation can happen there too. And so both sides are handicapped. We can't see each other, and we can't get those kinds of cues. And this can really be disconcerting if you're a beginner presenter, because you're not going to get any feedback from your audience that doesn't come through voice if your webinar allows it, and this one doesn't, or the chat box. So I can't tell if you're all sleeping or checking Facebook or whatever. So it's very easy for me to charge ahead with no sense of how the audience is responding. I don't get that in a webinar. How many of you have actually seen me, whether in person or a picture of me? Fair number of you. Okay. So you could probably pick me out in a lineup. Pick me out in a lineup. Quite a few of you. But your learners don't always know what you look like, and that's also a hurdle. Because doing online training is not the same thing as hosting a radio show that is purely entertainment. When you're doing training, it's assumed that the reason you're doing the teaching or the training is because you are some kind of authority on the subject that you have. And alas, we're human. If we're not blind, we do use our eyes to make judgments. People, you know, we're library people, right? Don't judge a book by its cover, but we do it, and we know our patrons do it. How many of you have had a patron come in and ask for a book by the cover color or illustration? Yeah. We're a pretty conformist group here. Yeah, no, we're very uniform. Yeah, absolutely, we do judge books by cover. Anybody who can see and is human typically does. So if you can't see me, it's harder for you to make judgments about me. And we make judgments based on appearance all the time, even if we know that isn't always accurate. So how do you get around this? Well, some webinar software allows for a video feed too, where you can show yourself sitting at the computer talking in real time. A lot of webinar packages don't do this, and honestly, even for those that do, they tend to suck up so much bandwidth that they're often not worth it, because they slow things way down, and then many people on the receiving end may not be able to receive the video, or maybe even on a dial-up connection. So what can you do to help people feel comfortable and build trust? Because that's really what it's about. How can you do that? It's not that hard. Not that hard. Add a picture of yourself to the opening slide. Now, I purposely did not do that simply for the purposes of this presentation, but I do like to do that often when I give webinars. Here's a picture of me, and of course, InfoPeople actually is rather good about it, because when they list presentations on their website or webinars, they actually include a picture of the presenter, and my suspicion is that that is where many of you saw the picture on the far left to begin with. Now, I like funny pictures too, and I have a logo that's also associated with me. But even if your photo appears in a printed or online program, this can be a helpful step to kind of help people remember who you are. Another common problem for when webinars can go bad is that you've only presented live. Now, honestly, you know, a lot of us probably have presented in front of an actual room of people. Just a quick poll. How many of you have actually stood up in front of a room of people and presented something? Oh, once again. Wow, okay, pretty much everyone, pretty impressive. Presenting a webinar, at least in my opinion, is actually harder than presenting live. Presenting live, you can get away with more mistakes, often because it's harder for people to go do other things, and because it's easier to engage an audience that you have eye contact with. Now, granted, people are still going to be playing on their phones and their tablets and, you know, doing whatever, but if you have eye contact, they're going to at least feel a little guilty about that. In a webinar, there is no guilt possibility because I can't stare you down or ask you a question or walk towards you or do, I used to be a teacher, like I said. So I have all these little tactics to kind of keep people with me, so to speak. That's not available in a webinar. And you can also be kind of blasé live, but being blasé when you're doing a webinar is absolutely deadly. Unless you're one of those rare people born to host a radio show, you're going to feel a little bit the fish out of water. The good news is, though, a lot of the things you need to do to be good at doing webinars are the same things you need to do to be good at a live presentation, which brings me to the next slide, number 3, if you're a presenting noob. If you were to ask my opinion, which you haven't, but I'm going to give it, I would never recommend that anyone start with giving webinars. Get very, very comfortable with in-person presentations first. Why? Because unless you are that rare person born to be a radio personality, you're likely going to have an extremely difficult time connecting to your audience. It's very helpful to know what audience expectations might be and how people react to certain ideas. I've had the opportunity to give the same presentation, both online and in person, and it's very striking to me to see the reactions to some things when I do it in person. Some ideas I present will often get people kind of uptight. I mean, for those of you who don't know, my nickname is Mean Laura. And in person, I can see the jaws clenching, the eyes narrowing. You can't see that in a webinar. But seeing it in person, I now know to preface certain things in my presentations with some warnings or disclaimers so people don't get quite so bent out of shape. So get comfortable with yourself so that you can project that over the internet. Webinars don't hide you, but rather I think they highlight both what you do well and what you don't. If you say a lot, believe me, in a webinar, that's going to be twice as noticeable when people have nothing to focus on but your voice. You don't really get human feedback in a webinar. So use live presentations to hone your skills first, if at all possible. And all of you have pretty much told me that you already do this, which I think is great. You're already ahead of the game. This one really came back to bite me a few years ago. I was invited to speak to a library consortium in another state, and I was told that it was going to be a mix of academic, school, and public librarians. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with me and what I do, I work specifically for public libraries, but I also communicate a fair bit with academic librarians. School librarians are my weak spot. But I was not told before I got there what the ratio was going to be of school to academic to school librarians. And at the time, and to kind of date this presentation, I was talking about Web 2.0, and I was supposed to give 4 different 1-hour sessions that day on Web 2.0 to this mixed group. And I got there with all my stuff prepared and all excited and all ready to go, only to discover that this huge room of like 200 or 300 people was almost entirely school librarians, and most of them did not have access to the majority of tools that I was discussing because they were all blocked in schools, which I did not understand or know at the time. So this really came back to bite me on the evaluations for good reason. I didn't do my research. So know your audience. I always ask now who my main audience is going to be if I don't already know. Ask the sponsoring organization if you can somehow pull the attendees before they come to the webinar. This kind of information can really be the difference between failure and success right there, knowing who they are and never assuming like I did. Make sure your content is a good fit for the people who will be receiving it. This is a big one I see a lot with webinars, is that people don't know the destination. Because just telling people stuff, no matter how engaging you might be, I mean, you might be the best stand-up comic librarian on the planet, but it's not really effective. The whole point of any training, online or off, is to move people from point A to point B, from a point of not knowing stuff to a point of knowing stuff. Really, this is what you're trying to get to. You're trying to get people from the point of where they came into your webinar, whatever that might be, that's point A, to your big idea. When you're getting ready to write the description for a webinar, the first thing you need to do is figure out what the big idea is. What's the end goal? What should people leave the webinar with? And in fact, when I work for info people doing webinars, they're very good at this because they force you to do it in little bullet points. What are people going to get out of this particular webinar? And in fact, you see that in the program description. You're basically figuring out what the takeaways are. What's the big idea you're trying to get across? What one major concept do people have to know by the time the webinar is over? And this is your big idea and the thing around which your entire webinar should be geared. And I see a question from Beth. Shouldn't your webinar description provide people with an idea of what the topic is and a level of knowledge to be transmitted? An introduction? Absolutely. Absolutely. All I'm saying is that this is also something that should be included, Beth, is that what are people going to get out of it? I would definitely want an overview of the topic as part of the description if I were a person thinking about attending a webinar or any other kind of training, and I would want to know how difficult the subject matter was and any prerequisites. That's a good question. Number 6, you're boring. This is probably one of the most common things that I personally run into, and from my prior poll, it sure seems that it is for you folks too. Again, you only have the webinar tools, your content, and your voice to engage people with. You generally have a much more limited bag of tricks than if you were presenting in a room full of people. You know, in a webinar, I can't get up there and dance or sing or anything, so it's easy to become kind of complacent and just put your material out there and hope something sticks. Beth asked a follow-up question too. I mean, when it comes to knowing your audience, can you clarify that for me as I move on, Beth? I'm not sure what it means in that context. And that could be because my brain is running a mile a minute and you're perfectly clear, or because I'm not quite sure. So here's a quick summary of the main things that can go wrong. I think probably the most common that most of us have run into is number 6, you're boring. But I would also say that I hear number 5 a lot as a problem. So how do you fix these common webinar presenting issues? Let's get started at the very beginning, and I do mean the very, very beginning of doing a webinar. Being an early bird, literally. Arrive early so you can welcome folks, and I try to do that. And I try to engage them in the chat box a little bit. Today we were lucky with some interesting music going in the background. That was a good conversation starter. Finding out where people are from, I think, is really nice. It can also give you a feel for the people in the room, whether or not they have a sense of humor or not, which is important for me since I tend to lack a sense of tact on many occasions. It also gives you a chance to interact with them, show you're a real human being before things get underway, because I'm suspecting most of you have not seen me in person. You have probably seen my picture. I also think I missed a question a little farther back, so give me a second here. From Suzanne, will Laura cover image resources, i.e. where those TED Talk type of images can be found and whether they are copyrighted or not? No, I won't be covering that, Suzanne, but tell you what, corner me again at the end and I will I can cover that a little bit for you. That is a good question. I wasn't going to cover images specifically. This is more about the actual presentation facets, but that's a good question. All right, something else you can do is to open with a grabber slide, a visual that's going to grab your audience's attention. You might remember that I opened with a pic of, it wasn't actually me, but it might as well have been me, the bored girl with the arrow, right? That's me during virtually every webinar that I attend. That's my grabber slide. Get people to wake up. Give them, and also kind of give them an expectation of what's coming up. Now, that doesn't mean that you use a grabber slide and then everything after is boring. That's a pretty sure path to failure too. So make sure that it sets the tone for your webinar. You also need to use a hook. It's up to you to engage your audience right away with a powerful and relevant hook that includes the word you. Because remember, most of your job is to persuade the audience of your big idea. And to be persuasive, you have to make it relevant, right? I was telling you the story about when I worked in environmental education. I had to make things relevant to those kids. And you have to make it personal to the people listening. What are they going to get out of it? Because people are inherently selfish. They want to know what's in it for them. And if you don't think you're selfish, you absolutely are. If you're human, you're inherently selfish. Sometimes we've been trained to not act selfish, but when we're by ourselves, darn it, we're selfish. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that my blog is called, What Does This Mean to Me, Laura? Because people want to know right away what the connection is to them. What's the payoff for them? Think about every infomercial you've probably ever seen. They start off by telling you what your problem is, right? You have dirty clothes. You have hair loss. You have da-da-da-da-da. They're building a relationship here. They understand your problem. Then they attempt to sell you a solution for your problem. The message is simple. We understand you, we trust, so you should trust us, and we can fix it for you. And you have to establish the same sense of relevancy and trust by first making sure that people know you understand where they are and how you can help. And this is essentially the point A that I mentioned earlier, from which you're going to guide your audience to point B, your big idea or the destination. You also need to forge an emotional connection, which means using a high I to you ratio, meaning you're going to say more things about them than about me. For example, don't say, I'm going to talk to you about XYZ today, which I did, and then I corrected myself because I'm terrible. This is one I'm working on. Absolutely. I won't pretend that I'm not. But say, I'm going to talk to you about XYZ today, and you really should be saying, in the next hour, you're going to learn about XYZ. Again, applying it to them, or in this case, applying it to you, because you all want to know why you're sitting here. And if you're not enjoying it, you're no doubt on Facebook by now. This is one of my most common pet peeves. This drives me absolutely insane in an in-person presentation or in a webinar. Reading verbatim from the slides. When the presenter reads verbatim from the slides, it drives me crazy because we've all seen people do this in a regular presentation. How many people have seen this? I can't, I think just about everyone has their hands raised. I can't imagine that by now not everyone has seen this. And you'll notice that I rarely use bullet points at all. And what you'll often see in many presentations, online or off, is that people will use bullet points purely as a crutch. And they figure if they just read the bullet points, they're doing their job. But this is not an engaging way to go. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes me want to go surf and check my email. Like, well, I could read that myself. You know, I don't need you to read it to me. It's not story time, really, is it? So what's the point of listening to the presenter, because you can just go read the slides and do some, later and go do something else. Keep in mind also that if you're doing a webinar, it's likely that people are going to be using a social media back channel. Many cases, that's going to be Twitter. For example, we've got a couple different hashtags for this particular presentation. So chances are, I haven't gone to look yet because I'm already moving between two different computers right now as it is. But chances are some of you are already tweeting this, at least I hope so, for good or for bad. So if you're doing something as egregious as reading verbatim from the slides, where you keep reading your slides, chances are good that hundreds of people are going to know about it, because people are going to complain about it bitterly on various outlets like Twitter. No pressure, right? Robin says, I find it helpful to have bullet points on my slides if I'm giving handouts in person. I don't want to read bullet points. That's all I'm going to say about it. This is where Laura's sense of tact disappears. I hate bullet points. I think that as a grown-up, I should not be forced to read bullet points. That's just my point of view. Kristen says, when we do webinars, people always do want copies of the slides afterwards to help remind them what is covered. How do you balance between reading too much on the slides or not providing enough info on the slides? I don't. Mean Laura strikes again. I don't give, first of all, I don't give handouts. If people want to download my slides, they are welcome to, and I warn them ahead of time. I don't do handouts. I think most people go and throw them in the trash, and if you don't, I think you're one of a very small minority. And if people really want to see my slides, they can. In many cases, particularly with webinars, things are recorded. If they really want to listen to it again, they're going to get more out of listening to it than seeing the slides. Or you can take notes. Like I said, I'm mean, and you can write that on the evaluations. Laura is mean. She's not considerate. That's okay. I've been there, done that. So that's just where I come from, and I realize that that's not a stance everybody has. But as a former environmental education teacher, I refuse to give handouts because those things end up in a recycling bin. So is there a real balance between reading too much on the slides? I think that people should be able, hopefully from the slides, to at least have something click in their head and go, oh, okay. As you notice, I try to at least put headings on the slides. I guess there is some sense of balance there. I might be over-exaggerating my sense of meanness, perhaps. I don't know if that answers your question or not, Kristen. Might have just made you run screaming into the night, but I guess we'll find out. This is another pet peeve. Just reading from a script and not letting people ask questions, or I think forcing people to ask questions at the end. You know, at that point in my head, I'm thinking, just podcast it already. This is related to the previous slide, but instead of reading the slides, now you're reading your notes verbatim. And the attendees can't see you doing this in a webinar, which is helpful, of course, but believe me, you can hear it. And I'm sure that you've all been there. You can hear somebody just kind of reading things as they go along. You do need to know your subject well enough so that you can do the presentation without your notes, just like if you were doing it in front of an in-person audience. And that way your notes become just a memory aid rather than that crutch. Robin says, a participant, I use handouts to take notes and remind myself of points afterwards. Yep. I say bring a notebook or a tablet. But that's, again, I'm mean. So you can write that on the eval. I'm okay with that. This is another point that I am terrible at. I admit that right there. So you're getting to know all my weaknesses as a presenter today, too. And people always tell me it's not a race. It's not a race. In fact, I came from upstate New York, not New York City, but upstate New York. And when I first came to Ohio, I actually went first to college in southern Ohio, right near Western Virginia. And the girl across the hall in my freshman dorm and I struck up a conversation only to discover that we virtually could not understand each other. I had never encountered such a thing. She spoke with a very almost southernish drawl. It's not really a southern drawl, but it's a very slow kind of drawl dialect way of speaking. And I was going like, you know, faster than I am now, if you can imagine that. And we really had a hard time because I would talk so quickly and she would talk so slowly. Yes, West Virginia and Virginia, definitely not the same. And I discovered that much to my chagrin. And so it is not a race. And it's natural to have an urge to speak quickly when you're presenting to a large group. You know, and somewhere I think subconsciously in the back of our minds we're going, okay, please, just let it be over. If I do this really fast, it'll all go away. But remember, too, in a webinar, there can be a short lag from what you see on your screen to what attendees see on their screen. And that lag can range from, you know, a fraction of a second to a few seconds, depending on internet upload speeds, the connection quality, maybe where they are geographically. So in theory, you're supposed to slow it down a little bit, which I'm terrible at. So you can put that on the evals too. I'm okay with that. So just so you know, when you're practicing, you can do better than I do. It's not a race. But by the same token, that pace can't be too slow. A while ago, when I was putting this presentation together, I asked my Twitter folks, if you will, my Twitter followers, about things they hated about webinars. And this one, I don't remember who said it. I should have put it into my notes, but this was one that came back as a tweet. It said, the pace, which is inevitably timed for the ones in the group who have no clue. So you get the people who speed ahead, and then you get the presenters who go so slowly because they are basically presenting to the lowest, slowest common denominator. And you need to find something in between so that people are not bored to death. So go more slowly, but not too slowly. Don't you love that? Right in the middle. We also need to facilitate participation as presenters, and this is really, I think, more difficult in a webinar. I mean, we do have these tools like the little check mark, we have the question box, we have the chat box, we've got the hand. But I do like it when presenters incorporate polls and ask questions. I think it's a great use of the technology, and it keeps people kind of engaged. And I also think that you should be trying to answer questions as they're happening. And this is harder to do because you have to do the webinar and keep an eye on the chat and the raised hands. But it ends up with, I think, a much more effective session because people are acknowledged during the course of the presentation. And these kinds of, if you want to call them interruptions, I think they add variety and a sense of engagement to things. One of the best pieces of advice I've ever seen about presenting is to tell stories. People rarely remember your exact words. Instead, they tend to remember mental images that your words create for them. So support your key points with relevant stories. I've told you a couple of stories at least already today. One thing I've heard often, maybe you have also, is help them make the movie in their heads. It's a great thing, I think. Make the movie in their heads by using memorable characters, exciting situations, funny stories, and with a combination of your examples and the visuals that you have, it's going to be a much more memorable presentation. At the very least, I bet most of you will probably remember that turkey vultures throw up on things they don't like. They throw up on their enemies. If nothing else today, no, that's not your big takeaway, but I bet you'll remember it. I love this quote here, which I'm sure you all can read. Another reason to tell stories. Depending on the technology that you're using and the format of your talk, make sure you interact with the audience when it's most logical. This kind of goes back again, answering questions in context. I've already mentioned several times, you'll be sick of it, but I'm going to say it again, is to answer things as they come up. A simple method is to find the logical place and time, and you know, if nobody's asking questions, you can always stop and ask and say, you know, based on what you've heard so far, do you have questions? Does everything make sense? You know, or you can ask for commentary, and some of you have been really good and already given me that. I really appreciate that. But if you're getting absolutely nothing in that Q&A or chat box or whatever the particular webinar software has, feel free to throw questions out to the audience too. I think there's nothing wrong with that. Another thing that makes a webinar different from an in-person presentation, you really need to use more slides. One easy way to do this is to reveal bullet points one at a time as you bring them up. And this is one of the reasons I don't do bullet points, is because typically you're actually seeing my bullet points, but you're seeing them one slide at a time. You're not seeing them all at once. Using mostly visuals and a little bit of text. Remember, the only thing people have to look at, it's not you, it's your slides. So the more of those you have, the better. Sue asked a question, are there humorous pictures available online that you can add to presentations without violating copyright? There's another image question. There are, okay, real quick overview, because now there's been 2 questions. I wasn't originally going to cover this, but I want to try to accommodate it, and I think there's time. There are some free options for stock photography. I did not include URLs, obviously, but if you Google, or you're all library folk, you can find free stock photography. Stock Exchange is one, and I think it's Stock Exchange without the E, and it might be .ru. I'd have to go look, sorry. Maybe I'll try to send that to info people so they can send it out. It's one I've used often. You can pretty much use at will. Flickr, if you search for Creative Commons licenses, it does under the advanced search. There are ways to do that, so you can find things that are freely available. All you have to do is give attribution. And of course, there's always stock photography and clip art that can be purchased. There's lots of sites, Shutterstock, iPhoto, Fotolia.com. Thank you. Eve found it. Yes, that's the correct one. It's not .ru. It's I knew it was something weird. .hu. And again, you know, it's what you get what you pay for, or in this case, what you don't pay for, so the quality can be kind of but I have found occasionally things there that I can use, so maybe that would be helpful. So Sue, hopefully that answers some questions. Teresa asked another question. Any suggestions for webinars using more than one presenter? We've got 4 on ours. I think if I were going to do that, now I have not had, no, that's not true. I think I did one webinar once with more than just me. If I were doing it again, what I would probably do is I would make sure that I had all of us on Instant Messenger or some kind of social media back channel that's just us, so that we could communicate sort of in between ourselves. There might be software options and things like WebEx that do that. Certainly you're going to want to rehearse it before you get up there. I think a terrible thing is for everybody to bring their slides and just say, okay, now it's your turn, and not have any idea what anybody else is saying or how their stuff paces. So I would definitely recommend a little more practice with more than one person. Another thing you can do to kind of help yourself in a webinar is to think Hollywood. Be creative in your use of visual appeal. Now, does that mean a whole presentation full of lolcats? Well, no, although that actually might be kind of cool, and maybe I'll do that someday if people don't run screaming. But I do think that it's important to include things that are going to be amusing and going to be creative. Just as you would in a live presentation, you know, you're going to tell stories, you're going to give specific examples, but in a webinar, you're going to need even more interesting visuals because, you know, again, you're not going to be up there dancing around. So you need something that people enjoy looking at. What if you're giving a webinar to a small group? Is it silly to poll only 2 people, for instance? No, actually, I don't think so. And I've actually done this. I have done presentations where it's just me and like I don't know what's called, the room host. I guess in this case that might be Chuck and Eileen, because it was being pre-recorded for a class later on. And so I would do that, and I would ask them to interact. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, I think there's sort of an understanding that there's just you and them, and I think it kind of makes for a nice class. I mean, if you've ever had the opportunity to teach to a small group as opposed to a large one, it actually can be very enjoyable. So I don't think that's silly at all. And heck, the sillier the better sometimes. I kind of talked about this a little bit already. I said it right there. There we go. I remember listening to one trainer who constantly said, all right, after nearly everything he said. And I was truly ready to scream or kill myself, thus the noose, or something by the end of his presentation. Because what if, I kept thinking, what if I jump up and I said, no, it's not all right? What would he have done? Now, this kind of thing can drive your audience to suicide, or at least cause them to tune out or to leave. So avoid filler words. You know what I mean, all right. In a webinar, filler words sound even more prominent than in person, and I bet you've already noticed that, because I do tend to use occasionally. Think about whether you're using them. This is why it's important to have a run-through. Record yourself, especially if you're new to doing webinars, because you're going to be unpleasantly surprised, I can almost guarantee it, about how many times you use these kinds of words. Before you end your webinar, review. You'd probably do this in an in-person presentation too, but you always want to review your key ideas with the webinar audience before concluding. Remember, remind them, what are the big takeaways? What are they getting out of this? And when you do end on a high note, because your last words are going to linger. Make sure they're your own. Don't quote. Make sure they're your own words. You want people to take away your stuff, not somebody else's stuff. And make sure that they're powerful. So the pressure's on to come up with a good quote or some key idea that's well worded for the end of your webinar. Answer questions. Assume that there's going to be questions. Even if there aren't any from the group at the end, usually a good producer or the person producing the webinar or hosting the webinar will often ask questions to the audience. In my own experience, they've been very helpful. A good room host will do this rather than just kind of throwing up their hands and saying, oh, well, thanks for coming. I guess there's no questions. And again, you can always throw out your own questions too. Don't let people just walk away. I want to talk briefly about some tech tips. I had my own experience actually with some tech right before this webinar that I'll talk about in just a little bit too. The most common reason that a webinar tanks actually does not have anything to do with you as the presenter, which will make you feel a little bit better. Well, let me rephrase that. The failure, it's technology failure, but the failure is not actually the technology, but the failure of webinar producers, presenters, and participants, not just the folks in charge, to really think about the platform limitation and to test their computers. A lot of people will jump into a webinar and they have not gone through the full test. Now, I don't know what the sound test is like for this particular piece of software. They're using WebEx, and it's actually a newer version of WebEx, Stanley tells me, in just the last couple of days. But typically, most webinar software has something where people need to test their audio before they jump in. People don't always do that, and then you see complaints, I can't hear. Well, it's hard to feel sorry for those folks. But every platform has its requirements for browsers, operating systems, bandwidth, downloads, plugins that it requires. Usually everything has some kind of test. So one of the things that InfoPeople does, and if you have the opportunity to work with them or any other provider, they want to make sure that you do, is that you make sure that notices about the webinar go out frequently about, okay, make sure you test your software, because it often takes people more than one call to action to do something. And this is one of the reasons it's annoying, but this is why advertisers do it. It's why you see the same blasted commercial over and over and over, or you hear it over and over and over on the radio. because it takes more than one time. How many times have you gone, oh, yeah, and then you've heard it again. You're like, yeah, maybe I should look into that. And the next time it's like, oh, I better do that. We do. We need multiple reminders. So this is one reason why you should make sure that your folks who are coming hopefully have multiple reminders as well. Make sure that you are using a wired connection. Now, this seemed like common sense to me until I encountered some presenters where I guess it wasn't. You really cannot count on a Wi-Fi connection. The bandwidth is not going to be strong enough to get a lot of data across quickly. You can't count on it. It's a lot flakier regardless of where you are. I mean, you might be in your library and think we have the greatest Wi-Fi connection ever, but it's not going to be good enough to do the webinar as a presenter. Make sure that you're on a wired connection. This was so important to me and from my own experiences that a couple summers ago, and this actually happened when I was teaching a course on Drupal for info people, the internet went out at my house. Basically, Time Warner couldn't come out till like a couple of days, and I was stuck. I was like, I've got to have a place to do this. I can't work in Wi-Fi. Where am I going to go? Well, my in-laws offered me the use of their internet, and so I went to their house all excited, yay, you know, I've got wired internet. I get there and I discover that in fact all they had was Wi-Fi, and that their cable modem, where I could stick an Ethernet cable so I could have a wired connection, was actually located in their garage. Now, this might not seem so bad until you realize that they live on the shores of, almost literally on the shores of Lake Erie, and this was the middle of July in mid-season. And so I was trapped. I had to close the door so that I wouldn't get more midges than what was already in there. And it was sweltering hot. And for an hour, I taught from the garage, a little old table in the garage with an Ethernet cable that was maybe 5 feet long tops. Make sure you have a wired connection. But I can tell you that class went really well, although I sure needed to shower afterwards. Make sure you test the actual computer that you're on. Don't assume that just because the software works on your laptop that it's going to work on your desktop. I actually had this situation happen to me actually today, because I typically will do presentations from my laptop, which is wired into my modem. And then I'll keep my notes on my desktop, and as it so happens, they just came out with this new version of WebEx in the last couple of days, Stanley tells me, and it would not work on my laptop, and I had to switch things completely around just before this presentation and load WebEx onto my desktop so that I could use it there. So that kind of brings us actually to the next slide. Hope you're still there, unless you've all gone to check Facebook. Backups matter. Always have 2 computers. Always have 2 in case something like this goes wrong. I'm always thankful. This is not the first time I've had issues, particularly as you learn to work with different kinds of webinar software. They all have their quirks. There's always issues. Well, I shouldn't say there's always issues, but there's often enough issues that it makes you realize you need a backup. Also, make sure you have backup phones. Backup phones. I do not have cell service in my house, and so I have to use landlines. We had thought we were going to drop land service when we moved into this house, and no such luck. So I don't have anything but landlines here, and I have only cordless phones. So I have to make sure when I do a webinar where I only have phone access, not voice over IP access like this one, that I have 2 charged phones and hope that if one dies, I can just jump quickly from one to the other. So backups really do matter. I've had to do that more than once. So what does all this mean to me, Laura? Here are the takeaways, besides turkey vulture dietary habits. Webinars are harder, but overall they're basically the same thing as live speaking. A lot of the same issues that can kill an in-person presentation can make a webinar fail too. Webinars do have more limitations though, and they force you to be more dynamic, more creative, and there's more for a presenter to juggle because you're juggling the tech, you're juggling the webinar software, you're juggling the phone, probably a chat box, a question box, a presenter's list. So practice is absolutely essential. Remember, it's your job to get people to buy into the big idea, and to do that, again, by getting them from point A, of knowing little or nothing, to point B, where they buy into your idea, and they're eager to go back to work and implement it. That's how you know you've done it right. When people go back and go, okay, yeah, I can do this, and these are some ways that I can do that. And my last, this is thing that I'll leave you with today before I take further questions. I used to be, in my second career, I used to be a children's librarian, so I'm very familiar with story time. In my own experience and my own take on presenting well, it really is just another story time. Adults like stories too. We like to be entertained, and if you're entertaining, people will often get the big idea. And I see some questions heading in. These are different ways that you can stalk me online, and I'm going to try to catch up on things that I've missed in both the chat, because here's there's 2 boxes. There is a lot to juggle. Oh, Kate says I should be blogging that adventure. I'm guessing you mean the midges in the garage. I'd rather forget that, honestly. Let's see what else I've got here. Yes. Okay, yes. Yeah, that's a day I could live without. It was not my favorite presentation experience, although it makes for a good story. Also recommending headsets with a mic for presenter. Yeah, that's another one. When you have the opportunity to work with software that allows for voice over IP, that is definitely preferable. Like right now, I'm on a phone, which is, as I understand, that's going to go away. Stanley tells me, see, there's my Stanley tells me that actually InfoPeople is moving to, I believe, Adobe Connect, which is going to allow for voice over IP, and that will make lots of us very, very happy. Chris asks, any special tips for presenting an in-person presentation that is also broadcast as a webinar? I'm trying to think if I've done that. I think I did do that. In fact, I know I did that about 3 or 4 years ago, but boy, that brings back memories. You have to remember people can't see you. I'm making an assumption that there's not a video feed with this. If there is, then probably there's very little difference. But if making an assumption that there is no video feed, again, people can't see you. So like right now, I could be waving my arms wildly or doing a jig. You don't know that. Same thing if you're doing a webinar concurrently with an in-person presentation, is that, you know, if you're going to say something is this big, well, you can't see my arms, you know, saying it's this big, you can only hear me saying it. So you've got to make sure that your visuals are sort of providing enough context. That's a good question. Just catching up on some other things or other questions. Repeat questions from audience into the mic. Danny says, yes. I try to do that. I'm not sure I'm always successful, but repeating questions is particularly helpful for people who are watching a webinar over again or people who were not there originally. Not every piece of software, again, in my own experience, actually provides the questions or the chat box concurrently or in sync with the audio. So there may, in fact, be only the audio portion, which is another reason why it's so important to have a repeat of the questions into the audio feed. Or people who didn't hear it in the room, yes. Absolutely, Nelda added that. Any tips on software training on a webinar? Hard for me, Bonnie, I'm thinking about this. I've probably used just about every piece of software out there, and I was saying this to Stanley earlier. They all sort of blur for me as a presenter because many of the ways that you do things are the same. I mean, it's much like if you've used Microsoft Word, you can probably pretty easily move over to OpenOffice because a lot of the icons are the same. I mean, from a usability perspective, it doesn't make sense to recreate the wheel for every new piece of software. I think that's true very much so also for presentation software like WebEx or Adobe Connect or Illuminate or whatever. Although I have to tell you, the way you upload things in Illuminate is pretty weird. So if anybody has to use that, you have my sympathies. But for the most part, I think it's usually a good idea to do a run-through from the technological standpoint. And nowadays, I think the InfoPeople folks just let me log in a half an hour earlier or so, and we just do a sound check and make sure that everything is as it should be. But if this is the first time for you working with a particular piece of software, or even with a provider, like even if I've worked with Adobe Connect with other providers, it could be configured very differently with this other provider. Like if I've worked with a different consortium, they could have a different version. So I think it's always good to do a run-through. And Kate agrees with that. Yes, always do a run-through. Technological run-throughs are really important. I mean, think about bands who perform. They're always doing sound checks, and that's really what a technological run-through is to make sure that sound is working, your slides are looking the way they should. Always important stuff. Good questions. And if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm here for 5 more minutes, or you're welcome to send them to me any of these ways also that you see on the slide. I will take things that way also. I appreciate all of you coming and listening to me rant and rave today, even though you couldn't see me actually waving around. And good luck on all of your webinars. I can't wait, hopefully, to see some of them.
Thank you, Laura. I think everybody learned a boatload, and I think we're going to refer all our new webinar presenters to this archive because you really pretty much covered everything that's important.
Cool.
So thank you. And just as a reminder, this will be archived, so you can refer anybody who needs a lesson in how to do a webinar to it as early as later this afternoon. So thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.